Oh, right. This is chapters 24 and 25. And the reason I'm laughing is I just recorded for over an hour, I think. Well, maybe it was about an hour, this chapter already before I realized at the very, very end that I hadn't hit record. Oh my God. And I was on a rant. I'm telling you. Like some of you liked my rants. I was on a effing rant. I might get on the rant again, but it's gotta lose some of its sting because I just did this rant. And I don't want to fake rants. My rants come from the heart. So if I get ranting again, great for all of us, I suppose. Well, except for the people who don't like the rants. But anyways, I have to cut this now for the second time. All right, chapter 24 and 25 of When the Night Comes Falling deals with forensic evidence and circumstantial evidence, and it has to do with setting up the probable cause affidavit, the PCA. The PCA, the probable cause affidavit, is what was used to go before a magistrate judge. That's basically a judge whose only purpose basically is to do procedural type things, not a trial judge, but the magistrate judge who basically just does procedural things like issuing a search warrant. So this is going to be how they got a search warrant on Bryan Kohberger and how they came to his name. What you're going to find, I'm going to cut to the chase on these two chapters, is we're going to find that the feds had circumstantial evidence that wasn't good enough to get a probable cause affidavit or an arrest warrant. The Moscow Police Department had circumstantial evidence that wasn't good enough to get a search warrant and a probable cause affidavit to arrest him. And somehow and both of them knew that their case by themselves was not good enough to get a probable cause affidavit signed by a magistrate. But somehow they did some kind of weird machination to take two not good enough pieces of evidence and put them together to make a good enough piece of evidence to get a search warrant or an arrest warrant. So that's kind of the gist, the summary of this two chapters, is that Moscow PD didn't have good enough information that any judge would sign off on as an arrest warrant. The feds didn't have enough that any judge would sign off on as an arrest warrant. They put the two pieces together, and technically neither one of them were good enough on their own, but put together they come up with a way to convince a judge to sign off on a search warrant. That is the gist of these chapters. Oh my God, let's record it again. So this first part's talking about the feds hiding from Moscow PD that they have been looking at Bryan Kohberger. So the murders happened, I believe, on the evening of the 29th or the 12th of November was when they were all out partying. And it was the morning of the 13th of November that the murders happened. And now we're going to find out December 19th is a big date. It's over a month after these events. And so we're going to talk about how this all came together. And the feds, so Othram Labs, so let's back. I just keep backing up one step. So at the crime scene, a knife sheath was found. That was sent off to a lab, Othram Labs, who does testing for Moscow PD. They found a speck of DNA that was invisible to the naked eye, the size of a grain of sand, essentially, and couldn't come up with a hit. They ran it through crime databases known as CODIS. They couldn't come up with a hit. And then the federal government, FBI, said, let's take over that sample. Let me have the sample. We got other ways. We got other tools under our belt to look for. We'll see if we can find a profile. They developed a profile through ways that we will find in Howard Blum's book and in the court documents, if you follow the case, were less than ethical. So the federal government, the FBI, did some shit that was a little sketchy on how they developed their profile on Bryan Kohberger, because Othram couldn't come up with it. The feds did. When the feds came up with a hit to Bryan Kohberger, they kept that information from Moscow PD. They did not tell Moscow PD they now had an idea that it's Bryan Kohberger, because they didn't want to have to explain. And that comes out in the book. Howard Blum makes it clear that the feds knew that the way that they came up with Bryan Kohberger's name for the crime scene wasn't going to stand up in a court of law. And so their hope was that Moscow PD would come up with Bryan Kohberger's name on their own. When it became clear, and I'm summarizing where we're going with this chapter, when it became clear that Moscow PD was not going to come up with Bryan Kohberger's name on their own, they, knowing that they can't really use in court how they got Bryan Kohberger's name, said, hey, let us give you a little tip. You should be looking into this guy named Bryan Kohberger, hint, hint, nudge, nudge. And then after Moscow PD was given the name Bryan Kohberger through ways that they shouldn't have given them the name, then they said, okay, if we know it's Bryan Kohberger, let's see how we can tie Bryan Kohberger to the scene. That's the summary of these two chapters. Once we've been told Bryan Kohberger is the guy you should be looking at, now let's see how we can tie Bryan Kohberger to the scene. It's not working the way you should be, which is that let's look at all the evidence and who does it lead us to? It's no, here's who the guy is. Now work backwards and find how you can get him to be at that scene. That's how it happened. Now, talking about the federal agents, not only were the agents determined to keep their activities secret from the chief suspect in the quadruple homicide, but for reasons shaped by pure private logic, they were also set on making sure the Moscow task force had no inkling either. Now, I read that kind of incorrectly. What it says is the feds didn't want Brian Kohberger to know they were investigating him. Point one. And point two, they didn't want Moscow PD to know they were investigating Brian Kohberger. So they're keeping it secret not only from Brian Kohberger that they're watching him, but they're keeping it secret from the Moscow Police Department. Why? Well, we get into that a little bit. The local team never knew that their federal partners in the case had a match on the knife sheath DNA, or that the Bureau was now intent on tracking the suspect's every move. So again, the feds took over the investigation on the genetic genealogy information and didn't tell Moscow PD until the 19th of December that they made a match or somehow linked it to Brian Kohberger. They're keeping that under their hat. In their determination not to tip their hand to the Moscow task force, the watchers had decided not to pick up on the Kohbergers until the car got well out of the area. This didn't seem a problem. They knew what route the travelers would be taking, but the Bureau's supposition had been wrong, and the white Hyundai, along with its invaluable passengers, seemed to have vanished. Now, let me explain what happened right there. So the feds have the feds have Brian Kohberger on their radar. They're watching him. Michael Kohberger comes into town to pick up his son, and the two of them, so Michael Kohberger flies into Seattle, flies into Moscow, Idaho, meets up with his son in Pullman a month after the murders, and the two of them are going to drive back in Brian Kohberger's car back east to where the Kohberger family residence is at. And the feds are still not telling Moscow PD that they're watching Brian Kohberger, that they're all over Brian Kohberger like white on rice and a cup of milk and a paper plate in a snowstorm, to borrow Major Payne's phrase. So anyways, so they're all over Brian Kohberger, but they're not letting Moscow PD know about it. And they purposely don't want to let Moscow PD know they're watching him. So they wait. They're going to wait until Brian Kohberger is out of the jurisdiction of Moscow PD before following him, because they're so determined to make sure Moscow PD doesn't know that they're watching Brian Kohberger. Howard Blum alludes to the idea that the feds may have been just simply wanting to get the credit for making the arrest on a quadruple homicide and not the local police. And so they're going to hide from the local police instead of working with the local police, even though they're stationed, by the way. We know that the feds were stationed, co-located with Moscow police from almost day one of this investigation. When they found the name Brian Kohberger, they kept it a secret because this was a big feather in their cap. They wanted to get the arrest. This is the same thing that happens over and over again. The feds love to try to scoop the local authorities and be the one to make the arrest. If they feel like they can't do it or they're going to be embarrassed by it, then they just turn it over to the local police and say, oh, you know what, you guys take care of it. But if they're going to be able to get credit for it, you're damn sure they're going to try to make sure that they scoop the local police and be like, well, you know, you needed the feds to make that case. So that's what I feel like Howard Blum is actually on the right track. The feds wanted to get the scoop. They wanted to be the ones to be the heroes, to catch the bad guy. And so they're keeping information that could be helpful if they would just work with the local police, but they're going to keep it under wraps. But what happened is that in their effort to hide from the local police what they're doing, they don't follow Kohberger out of the city. They allow him to get out of jurisdiction of Moscow Police Department and then decide to follow him. Problem was, Brian Kohberger and Michael Kohberger didn't go on the highway they expected them to go back east. And so they're like, where the heck is the car? We should be picking them up right about now. Presumably they had cars waiting for Brian Kohberger's car to show up on the highway after they'd left the area, and Brian Kohberger's car didn't show up there because he went a different route. They talk about this earlier in the book, where Brian Kohberger and his dad got into a fight over the fact that Michael Kohberger knew exactly the fastest way to get home, and Brian wanted to go a different route, and they fought about it early on. Now the feds are completely surprised because they didn't go the obvious way out of Pullman. Then it talks about how Brian Kohberger was stopped twice in Indiana, and Blum sets up an argument that the feds are freaked out because the feds want to make the arrest. They want to be the big man on campus. They want to be the hero. And now all of a sudden they're watching as they're tailing Brian Kohberger in multiple cars, and they're following him by an airplane in the sky. They notice that Indiana police pull over Brian Kohberger not once but twice, and they're freaked out. Did somebody tip them off? Does Moscow PD know? And Moscow's called it into Idaho to Indiana. What's going on here? Have we been scooped? Have we been scooped? Why are they all over our guy? Turns out this is the part that I want to just question the motives of the federal government when you'll see, according to this paragraph, Howard Blum suggests that the feds were a little bit concerned that this could go badly for local police in Indiana, that they're stopping the suspect, the lead suspect in a quadruple homicide, and they don't know what they're getting into. What if Bryan Kohberger is armed? What if he decides to harm a police officer to get away? What if he speeds off in a high-speed chase and innocent people are, you know what? Let's just roll the dice and see what happens. That's their ultimate conclusion. All these things are going through the Fed's mind, that this could turn into a complete shit show and harm people and get a cop killed or get innocent people killed. And ultimately the decision was made, let's just roll the dice and see what happens. Let me read it for you. Was the suspect armed? Would someone who they believed had killed 4 people hesitate to kill again? Was the sheriff deputy in danger of becoming another victim? Perhaps they should abandon their cover and intervene before the situation escalated. Didn't the possible threat to a lawman's life supersede everything else? Or another troubling consideration, maybe Kohberger would wouldn't stay put on the shoulder. He would gun the Hyundai and race down the highway. As a decision had to be made. Finally, the order went out from command to stand back, at least from now. So again, all of these thoughts, according to Howard Blum, are going through their mind. This could turn into a shit show. A cop could get killed. Innocent people can get killed. Maybe we should just let them know we're trailing this guy and that he's a suspect in a quadruple homicide. Nah, let's just see what happens. Now, here we go with Howard Blum's prejudicial telling us what Michael Kohberger is thinking. Did Howard Blum interview Michael Kohberger? I don't know. Did Howard Blum interview Michael Kohberger's friends and family to get the story third hand? I don't know. Did Michael Kohberger himself change his mind about things after he found his son had been arrested and all of a sudden his recollection of what happened that day changed? I don't know. But we're going to get to hear Blum tell us in the moment what Michael Kohberger is thinking when he's driving back with his son. So here we go. For days, Michael Kohberger had been, Michael, that's his father, had been struggling, however obliquely, to get a handle on an overwhelming sense of dread that had been weighing on him in the aftermath of his meeting up with his son in Pullman, at the Pullman Moscow airport. He had not tried to think about its origins, Michael later told relatives, but now Michael began to suspect that there must be something purposeful guiding the rapid succession of police stops, each one part of a whole, and its meaning was about to be made clear. Michael braced himself for what would happen next. So what the idea they want you to get is Michael Kohberger already suspects his son as being a mass murderer already. So he shows up in Pullman and he thinks his son probably did something horrible. And now his suspicions are rising as they're getting pulled over multiple times in Indiana. Oh shit, I knew it. My son's done something bad. And now Michael Kohberger is thinking shit's hitting the storm, or, you know, the hitting the fan. My son's going to get arrested for what I know he's done in my heart. I don't know that that's not Howard Blum adding a lot of thought into what what Michael Kohberger was thinking in the moment. I don't know. Brian, respectful. Now we're talking about the interaction from the police officer for the second time, because I just did all of this just a few minutes ago. For frick's sake, hit the record button, for God's sake. Anyways, Brian, respectful, cooperative, replied that only a few miles down the highway, they had been stopped for an identical infraction. Yes, Brian Kohberger was stopped twice in Indiana. This is what freaked the feds out. What do they know that they shouldn't know? Because this should be our investigation, our scoop. Why is Indiana stopping him multiple times? So on the second stop, he's telling the officer, hey, we already got stopped once before. The troopers seemed suddenly suspicious. That was a stretch of highway, his stretch of highway. There wouldn't be another statey patrol lane close by, so why lie? Michael jumped in to clear up the confusion. He explained that it had been a sheriff's deputy, and that made sense. The trooper decided it was a county guy. It was like a black SUV. So yes, it does seem that the officer seems like, are you making up a story? You just got stopped. He knows that can't be the case. He's the only statey. But then they point out it was another jurisdiction, another law, jurisdiction or department. And so he's like, oh, okay, I get it. As the car pulled back onto the highway, Michael played back the encounter in his mind. His son's emotional temperature, he recalled, hadn't appeared to have jumped a notch. Only later, he'd wonder to a relative whether that was the demeanor of someone who had nothing to hide, or was it the icy calm of someone incapable of feeling fear. That is another, again, I believe, highly prejudicial statement by Howard Blum. One could break down what happened was Michael Kohberger said, my son didn't act like anything was wrong. He looked perfectly normal. We were pulled over by 2 state patrol and his son acted completely normal. But then Howard Blum will add later on, is it that his son had nothing to hide? Or was it the icy calm of someone incapable of feeling fear? Is that Howard Blum? Or is it truly Michael Koberger? Or is it Michael Koberger after his son has been arrested and now he's reflecting back on it and trying to say, oh yeah, I always had suspicion that something was wrong? Because that's what people do as well. So in the moment, Howard Blum, are you really in Michael Koberger's head in the moment that that's what he's thinking? Or is this retroactive? Is this whatever? I don't know. As for Michael, now that they were edging closer to their family dense forest, so now they're across the country, they're arriving home, and humpback peak of the Poconos, he found himself wishing that the journey would go on forever, that they would just drive and drive, for he had begun at last to put a name on what he suspected he would find at the end of the trail. So now he is trying to claim again in Michael Koberger's head that as they arrive home, Michael Koberger is convinced his son's a killer, that they're all over him. That's why they were stopped in Indiana, and that this is all coming to a head. And he just kind of wished they could just drive and drive and drive and ignore what he knows is coming. His son is a killer, and he's going to be arrested. All right, now we're getting into the last chapter, and this starts to get where I had some of my biggest rants on the famous video that didn't get recorded. We're going to try it here. I'm going to try not to force a rant. I do not want to force a rant, but it makes me spun up. I got super spun up. I'm going to tone that down. I got super spun up about some things some people said to me. I'll mention it. Maybe it'll spin me up again. We'll see. All right. By now, the Bureau had learned that the Indiana authorities' vigilance had been prompted by a drug interdiction operation that zeroed in on out-of-state license plates. Now, here's where we're going to go. A friend of mine told me that, yes, if you are driving the speed limit across the country on a highway, you're going to get pulled over because that's suspicion of drug running, because drug runners are going to always obey all the laws. I think this is one of the dumbest things ever, for us to suggest that by obeying the law, you make yourself suspicious, and that's probable cause to pull you over. It's not probable cause to pull you over. Officers should not pull you over because you're obeying the law. What does that say in America? If you're suspicious if you speed, and you're suspicious if you don't speed, you're just suspicious driving while American. That's it. You know, it's the famous, people say they got arrested for driving while black. Well, you know, Howard Blum and maybe even my friend is trying to suggest that you're suspicious if you're driving while American. Because if you're obeying the law, you're suspicious, because only drug dealers do the speed limit. And so that's what he's actually trying to hint. He's trying to hint that the reason why the Kobergers were pulled over had less to do with tailgating, but more to do with the fact that they were two white males driving in a car across the country doing the speed limit. And that the whole story about tailgating was just invented as an excuse to pull them over because they're really looking for drugs. Now, I have multiple problems with that, multiple problems, including the fact that they don't seem to ask any kind of questions about drugs. There's nothing like that. But that's Howard Blum's take as well. They're pulled over because they're looking for drugs, in particular out-of-state license plate. Here was another rant I made. I'll be brief on it this time. Another rant I made. So you're on an interstate highway. It goes from coast to coast. You're on an interstate highway, and your probable cause for pulling people over and harassing them on the highway is that they have out-of-state plates. So in other words, you're saying you want to follow this logic, that you're on a highway that goes coast to coast and crosses through multiple states. But if you happen to come from another state into Indiana, that makes you suspicious. What the fuck are you doing on our international highway? Why don't you have Indiana plates? Well, you're an international highway. To get from here to there, I got to come through your state. Well, that makes you awfully suspicious. You're from out of town. This shit's asinine. Driving while American. All right. The locals would need to get involved now. So now they're talking about they're outside the Pennsylvania House, and the feds are realizing they're going to have to get the locals involved at some point. So that here comes we're leading up to some of the rant. The locals would need to get involved. The jurisdictional issues were impossible to ignore, but most persuasive, they'd come to realize it just didn't make sense to keep the Moscow task force out of the loop. It had grown clearer and clearer that they would need help to bring this case to the nearly ironclad juncture where an arrest would be legally possible. Full stop. Let's talk about this. The feds know they don't have justification to make an arrest. They need more information. Their evidence to arrest Brian Koberger is sketchy evidence on IgG information placing Koberger at the case, so they say, and they know it's not going to stand up in a court of law. They need a stronger case. Meanwhile, back in Moscow, Idaho, they know they don't have enough information because all they've got is, white cars driving around the area. They don't have enough information. They don't have a good enough case. So we're going to put together two cases that aren't good enough and somehow make it a case good enough, while simultaneously trying to ignore that you used information that wasn't good enough to make the arrest. All right. Now we're going to go talk about Corporal Payne. And this is where I lost my shit. I will try to lose my shit a little less. All along, Corporal Brett Payne, this is Moscow PD, had been praying for a name, and now he had it on December 19th. God dang it, man. I'm already starting to get irritated. On December 19th, the Bureau, according to official records, shared what had been discovered after the forensic genealogist had extended the DNA-rooted family tree to its furthest branch. Okay, first of all, that IgG information is sketchy, and they know it can't be used in court to get an arrest warrant, but that's how they got Bryan Kohberger's name, is using sketchy stuff that they know can't be used in court. Now they give a tip to the local police department, Corporal Brett Payne, on December 19th. Now, I'm going to try to not lose my shit as much as I lost last time. I made a video where I talked about Moscow PD didn't have Bryan Kohberger on their radar until December 19th. I know this because it came out in court documents. Ann Taylor grilled Corporal Payne and said, when was the first day you heard about Bryan Kohberger? I believe it was December 19th when the feds told us the name. And prior to that day, you didn't know Bryan Kohberger. That's correct. So prior to the 19th, you didn't know Bryan Kohberger. That's correct. So just to be clear, it was on the 19th that you got Bryan. Like, she said it 20 times. I remember reading it. I remember laughing. She's very clearly, you didn't know about Bryan Kohberger until the 19th. And then one day I have somebody that got under my skin. I made a comment about the local police didn't have Bryan Kohberger on their radar until the 19th. And they're like, you're completely wrong. They knew about Bryan Kohberger well before the 19th because they had a traffic stop where they had Bryan Kohberger well before the 19th. So you're a liar. Okay, no, I'm not the liar. Brett Payne, under oath, said we didn't have his name until the 19th. Now, here's where the two of us are partly right, but I take exception with you calling me a liar. Yes, Bryan Kohberger was stopped prior to the 19th, and that was recorded by a traffic incident. And Bryan Kohberger gave them the cell phone in that traffic stop. So, yes, the name of Bryan Kohberger was around in records prior to the 19th, but there was no connection between Bryan Kohberger and the murders of the Idaho 4 prior to the 19th. They didn't start looking at Bryan Kohberger as a suspect in the murders until the 19th. Brett Payne, under oath, said, I believe we got the name from Bryan Kohberger on the 19th. And prior to that, he was not on our radar. So while some of you want to question my integrity and call me a liar in front of public and make it look like I don't do my due diligence because I say that the local police didn't have Bryan Kohberger's name until the 19th, liar. They knew about him well before the 19th in a traffic stop. No association to the Idaho 4 murders. It was only after they were given the name Bryan Kohberger by the feds saying, hey, you need to look at this guy. Did they then go back and start putting together the story from earlier from the 19th? They had no connection prior to that point. Okay, I beat that to death. I beat it for the 50th time because I think I did 25 times in the first video and now another 25 on this one. Early on, this is talking about Corporal Brett Payne. He entered the name and license plate number that the feds had shared into the motor vehicle records system. A computer screen promptly displayed a state driver's license. It listed Bryan Kohberger as a white male, a sturdy 185. Now this is when he got the license plate. We're going to continue on. Which Payne told himself. So he's running the plates of the vehicle that was from a police officer who saw Bryan Kohberger's plates in Pullman. They'd ran it, and he sees Bryan Kohberger as a white male, 6 foot, 185 pounds, which Payne told himself was pretty close to the broad description of the intruder by Dylan Mortensen. And the drunk Dylan Mortensen, who changed her story a bunch of times, said that, hey, I think he was around 6 foot, maybe, athletically built, 180, 185 pounds. And he's like, oh, this is the guy. This matches the description. Okay. So now he also matter of factly conceded, however, that there are thousands of other guys at the U of I and WSU campuses that match that description of 6 foot, 185. So that's not particularly good. It's circumstantial evidence at best. He knows it. I know it. He knows that any judge will see it that way as well. Continuing on. Then he turned to the photograph of Bryan Kohberger. Was this the face of a killer? He stared at it intently, but for all his scrutiny, he saw nothing out of the ordinary. Now, to this day, many of you will look at Bryan Kohberger and say, oh yeah, he's totally a killer. You can see it. Corporal Payne, who deals with criminals all the time, is looking at the photo. He doesn't see a killer, but you guys got it all figured out already and got him convicted. Looks like a killer to you. Nevertheless, Even though Corporal Payne doesn't see a killer when he's looking at the photo, and again, I don't even want to get into the whole, can you tell what a killer looks like? Ted Bundy didn't look like a killer, in my opinion. Gacy didn't look like a killer in my name. But maybe you think that killers are identifiable by just looking at them, like Kohberger. Anyways, nevertheless, he kept boring into the photograph, and just like that, something caught his gaze. The eyebrows. They were bushy. Same as the kind that the intruder Dylan had spotted, or the intruder that Dylan had spotted. And this small confirming detail, while subjective, or too subjective to be admissible in a courtroom, further nudged his sense of urgency. Corporal Payne knows being 6 foot and 185 is not good enough for a judge in a courtroom. He knows so-called bushy eyebrows is not good enough for a judge or in a courtroom. And yet he's now convinced personally this is the guy. The feds told him it's Bryan Kohberger. Bryan Kohberger happens to be tall, like thousands of other people. He happens to have bushy eyebrows by hundreds of thousands of other people, and therefore, with that name and those two links, he's Caucasian, so maybe that would be another thing. You know, how many circumstantial things? Like there's a million people that fit this description, but hey, with the name and the fact that some of these things match up, he's good enough. That's good enough for him. With the number in hand, so now he's got, I think, Kohberger's phone number, and they're talking about the fact that Bryan Kohberger had been stopped before at a previous stop. Once the feds had told them Bryan Kohberger's name, they looked through the records, they found Bryan Kohberger had been stopped before, and that his cell phone, and then it comes to Corporal Payne. Oh, we searched all the cell phone records that night of who was in the area, and we got Bryan Kohberger's name. Certainly, we're going to find a match now. We're going to find Bryan Kohberger's phone was in the area of the murders. We got him. So with that number in hand, he reached out for another file. In the inchoate days of the hunt, however the hell you pronounce that word, he had blindly bombarded the phone companies with search warrants requesting information about any devices that had pinged on cell towers in the vicinity of the King Road residence between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. on the morning of the murders. Now he could return to this previously unjustified or unsatisfying list in a more purposeful way. So he got a list of a bunch of phone numbers, and it doesn't result anything. But now he's got a phone number to match. So now he's on to something. He searched to see if Kohberger's number had been recorded. This discovery would be the smoking, or more accurately, the pinging gun. But Payne found nothing. So, okay, I know who it is. I know it's Bryan Kohberger. He's got the right height. He's got the right look. He's got those damn bushy eyebrows. So we know it's the guy. And now we're going to go to try to piece together the evidence to prove that he was there. Oh shit, his phone's not in the area during the time. Kohberger's phone had not been caught at the crucial time by the cell tower in the vicinity of the murder house. It was not encouraging, but he decided to store this knowledge away until he hoped another part of the puzzle might give it more meaningful context. And so, undeterred, on December 23rd, more than 5 weeks after the murders, he decided to investigate what Kohberger's phone had been up to around the time of the homicides. Again, what's happening here? Paint the picture. We've been told it's Bryan Kohberger, so let's just keep digging and keep digging and keep digging until we find that connection. We don't see any connection. We don't have enough for going to court. Nobody's going to see this as good evidence, but we know it's him. So let's just keep digging and keep digging and keep digging until we get a case built. That's how this is done. Instead of looking at the information and see who it leads you to, it's, we know who it is. Let's work backwards and get that person at the scene. So, he sent search warrants to AT&T, the provider of Kohberger's cell phone service, requesting the records for the number between the November 12th and at 12 a.m. and November 14th at 12 a.m. A detailed report arrived back at his desk that same day, and with that, he began a steady, careful paper chase. Working side by side with the FBI, Benjamin Dean, an experienced FBI special agent at the Salt Lake City Field Office Cellular Analysis Survey Team, they set out to chart the interaction between Kohberger's pinging phone and the time-coded surveillance videos that had been captured, passing glimpses of the white Hyundai Elantra in the fateful hours after midnight on November 13th. When they were done, they'd put together a grimly compelling narrative. So, again, let me restate this one more time. We know who it is, so let's work the evidence in to getting him at the scene, because we know who it is. We've been told, FBI said it's Bryan Kohberger that we should be looking at, so we know who it is. Now we just got to get the evidence to fit. According to their reconstruction, Kohberger, or at least his phone, had left his apartment in Pullman at 2:47 a.m. on November 13th and had been heading south when abruptly it stopped reporting to the network. Was it turned off, switched to airplane mode, or for that matter, had the phone simply traveled into a rural area with no cell reception? This was northern Idaho, after all. Now, I kind of summarized and skipped through that a little bit faster, but the point being is that there's all kinds of reasons why the phone lost cell coverage. It could be it was turned off. It could be that it was put into airplane mode, or it could simply be that it lost cell phone connection in between towers. But these possibilities seemed highly unlikely when the videos that had captured what appeared to be Kohberger's car filled the pictures. There was the white Hyundai, the infamous suspect vehicle 1, recorded making 3 slow, laborious passes by 1122 King Road from 3:29 a.m. to nearly 4 a.m. The car then returned a 4th time at 4:04 a.m., only to abruptly disappear from sight. Yet at 4:20, there it was again, hightailing it out of Moscow at breakneck speed. Now, let me refresh your memory. In my memory, 4:01 to 4:20 looks like a 16-minute gap. I believe when you look closer at the documents, you'll see that you see the headlights of the supposed white Elantra hitting the side of a building nearby at 4:07 a.m., meaning the car's still in movement. So you see it off camera, the vehicle off camera at 4:04. That's the last time you see it. And you see it back on camera at 4:20, giving us a gap of 17 minutes, or 16 minutes, right? From 4:04 to 4:20, 16 minutes. But you'll later find out that the car's headlights is seen on the side of a house in motion at 4:07 a.m. So now you would have 4:07 to 4:20. That's a gap of 13 minutes, not 16 minutes. So we've lost a couple minutes. You can keep working through that thing, and you're going to see that the time gap, the maximum time gap of the killer arrived in this white Elantra at 4:07 and parked his car, went into the house and got out and left at 4:20 as 13 minutes. And then you got to factor in all the other stuff, the walking time, the going into the house, the committing the murders, the cleanup afterwards to not carry DNA out, all of that happening. It puts the time frame, in my opinion, around 8 to 10 minutes to kill 4 people on 2 floors. But we beat that on a million different videos. Just as suddenly, at 4:48 a.m., the cell phone pinged back to life, heading out south from Moscow on US 95. The device continued to ping its way in a circuitous route through the countryside, but at nearly 5:30 a.m., the phone was making its way back to Pullman, just at the same time as the surveillance cameras spotted the white Hyundai crawling back to the WSU campus neighborhood. So there's my dogs barking in the background, and I keep forgetting to put them away before doing a recording. And so now that she started, we get to deal with that. Anyways, the point being is that these are all circumstantial evidence. Brett Payne knows it's circumstantial evidence. The FBI knows it's circumstantial evidence. Everything's going to start making noise in my room. So there was also tantalizing coda to the drama that Payne and the FBI expert had stitched together. At 9 a.m., that Sunday morning, Kohberger's phone left Pullman, headed back to Moscow. Then, for 9 long minutes, an interlude heavy with mystery, the phone was pinging like crazy off the cell tower that serviced the King Road house. For many of the cops in the task force, the explanation was clear. The murderer was returning to the scene of the crime. So I want to focus a little bit, and I'm going to do a visual like I did the first video about the whole pinging like crazy off the cell tower that serviced the King Road residents. Some of you have seen this before and had it explained. I'm going to explain it to you one more time. Let's imagine, for example, that this is the cell tower. Let's imagine that this is the King Road residence, right? So this cell tower services the house at the King Road residence. Saying that Brian Kohberger's car pinged off of his phone number, pinged off the cell tower servicing the house, doesn't necessarily mean that Brian Kohberger's over here. He could be over here because this same tower services the same residence. So it's smoke and mirrors at first to just say, oh, his phone is pinging like crazy off the cell tower that services the house at this resident. That doesn't mean Kohberger was anywhere near it. He could be a long ways away over here. And in fact, if you take the distance between where he could be here or over here and put those two together, it is a long ass way. And in fact, that is what is being argued in court documents. As Brian Kohberger's vehicle is not at the scene of the crime, you're using clever manipulation to say that he pinged off the cell tower that services the house. And it's good enough for many people in America. Proof of guilt. Shit, Moscow is extremely small. That cell tower fucking hits everybody in Moscow because it's a small place. So playing these games that his phone pinged off a cell tower that services the resident of Moscow, Idaho, sounds really good to those of you who don't want to pay attention and don't want to do some critical thinking and ask deeper questions. Good enough for me. Brian Koberger has been named the suspect, and his phone pinged off the cell tower that services the house, proving he was there at the house that day. No, it does not. And they know that. And that's why they have had to do manipulations over and over again, and why the defense is getting pissed off, and why they're bringing in experts to say, you are playing games with the data. You want to convince the jury that what's being said is accurate when it's not. It's not accurate. So individuals, he would write, can either, now, so they're talking about why did the phone go off? Individuals, he would write, can either leave their cellular telephone at a different location before committing a crime, or turn their telephone off prior to going to the location to commit a crime. This is done by subjects in an effort to avoid alerting law enforcement that a cellular device associated with them was in a peculiar area where a crime is committed. And although he didn't come out and say it, it was further implication was clear. This shrewdness was precisely the sort of precaution a graduate student in criminal justice setting out to commit the perfect crime would employ. So in other words, he wants us to believe, oh, what a clever SOB. Of course, he would know that his phone could be tracked to the murder scene. So a smart guy would turn off his cell phone before heading to the murder scene. I would counter, and I hit this harder in the first video, but I'm deciding to cool it a little. I would counter, a smart guy wouldn't take his fucking phone to the crime scene in the first place. So you want us to believe, oh, he's so smart. He turned his phone off on his way to the murder scene and turned it back on his way back from the murder scene. That's really smart. Instead of, like, it would have been a lot smarter to just leave your effing phone at home if you're going to go commit a quadruple homicide. Why take your phone in the first place? Even more so, if he's so smart, why not put your phone somewhere else to give you an alibi where you're 20 miles away? Why not go someplace, leave your phone there, come up with an alibi that you were there fishing or something like that, and then drive away without your phone, leaving your phone somewhere else? That would be smarter, wouldn't you think? But these guys want you to believe, oh, he's so freaking smart. He drove to the scene, turned his phone off on the way there, turned it back on the way back from there, because he was clever. I would be way more clever to not have had the phone at all. How about even more clever, if he's such a smart guy, not taking your own vehicle through a town full of surveillance cameras? And don't act like you don't think Koberger knew that those cameras were there. Everyone knows. We all in America know that there's a million cameras. When you drive your car in any town in America, you're on a million different cameras. You all know that. It doesn't take a criminology student to figure out you're on camera. So again, he's so smart, he's a criminology student. Then why take your own vehicle to the murder scene? Why take your cell phone to the murder scene? If you want to paint a certain narrative, it's easy to get people to go there, but it doesn't make logical sense. But Payne is now convinced the cell phone records and the suspect vehicle, one vehicles, inexorably pointed towards Brian Koberger because they gave you his name. But he also understood that no judge, this is important, he also understood, Brett Payne knew, no judge would sign an arrest warrant for a murder that was stitched together with all this speculation. And he further conceded, when pressed by Chief Fry, all of the pinging phones might, under close scrutiny, add up to nothing than a lot of noise. Full stop right there. One, it's all circumstantial evidence. Police officers know it's circumstantial evidence. No judge will sign off on that bullshit. The cell phone data that you in America, a lot of, not you, again, I keep saying this, you who watch my show probably aren't, you would have checked out a long time ago. Because if you're convinced Brian Koberger is guilty, you don't give a shit hearing anybody say otherwise. So you're not watching this video, I'm assured, if you think Brian Koberger is fully guilty, because you checked out the second I said, hey, maybe he's not. Yep, I'm out. I know he's guilty. I'm out. So now that you're still here, we're talking rhetorically to people who still think Brian Koberger is guilty. They know it's all circumstantial evidence. They know even the cell phone pinging data that's convinced 3/4 of America that Brian Koberger had to be the guy, that he was fucking driving around the scene, so he's clearly the guy. Why is his phone pinging off the cell tower? Sir, if he's not guilty, we know he is. Well, they know, the cops know, that's not going to work. It's not going to fly in a court of law. It's not going to fly before a judge, and it probably is just horseshit. But it's convinced most of you, not you, a lot of people. All right. The discomforting truth was, the cell phone towers cast a wide net often as far as 12 to 14 miles. In a town like Moscow, that would take in a lot of territory. However tempting it was to claim that the data was irrefutable evidence, tempting, see, they're tempted to say this is irrefutable evidence, but they know it's not. The reality was that being in the vicinity was not the same thing as being at the exact same address. Law enforcement knows it's horseshit. Law enforcement knows they're manipulating the data to make it look better than it really is, and they're concerned. This isn't going to hold up in a court of law, but we're gonna make the case anyways because we got our guy, and all we got to do is baffle a jury long enough that they can believe it. I think we're at the last paragraph. Then there was Brian wearing white surgical gloves. This is at his house now, where his sister has come to believe that Brian Kohberger is the killer, based on what she saw and what she reported that night, and what the feds saw at this mysterious moment. It's earlier in the day, and then that night in the Poconos at their house, at their residence in Pennsylvania. Brian is wearing white surgical gloves as he suctioned the white Hyundai Elantras, or it doesn't say white, but he's suctioning his Hyundai's upholstery and trunk with a shop vacuum. Oh my God, not you. People in America say, oh my God, he's cleaning up the evidence of his car. Why over a month after the murders? Why 5 weeks after the murders, or so? A whole month after the murders, you're going to convince me now Brian Kohberger is going to deep clean his car. Like, if he committed the murders and there's no DNA of the victims in his car because he's so damn good at cleaning up crime scenes, why is he doing it a month after the murders? Is he going to wait a month? Or are you saying, again, this is a little bit closer to your narrative if you believe this, well, he already cleaned the car, obviously, after the murder, but now he's just doing another pass. He's just getting a little deeper clean. Maybe, but why again? Why a month after the murders are you concerned about getting DNA out of your car? Because that's what you're trying to suggest, that him vacuuming the car is him trying to get the DNA out. It could be that he's a clean freak, that he likes to keep his car clean. It could be that he doesn't like dirt and grime on his fingers when he's cleaning a car, so he wears gloves. I do the same thing. If I'm going to clean up something nasty, like a freaking ketchup spill in my car or whatever, I'll put on white surgical gloves to clean it up as well. Because especially if it's been there for a while and it's dried on and you wipe it and it gets that gross, I don't want it on my hands, and I'm not OCD. But he is a little OCD. But for you, that's proof of guilt, not for you. Right? You watching this show, you would have checked out a long time ago if you didn't think like I do. So the point being, he's wearing white surgical gloves, he's vacuuming his car, and then we also get told about in that night in the kitchen. There he was in the kitchen late at night, sorting the day's personal, whatever the hell that is, detritus, I don't even know how to pronounce that word, into plastic Ziploc bags. And though she had not set out to spy, and afterwards wished she had never seen it all, there was her brother sneaking out after midnight. I point out this is a clever use of adjectives, right? Or adverbs, I guess in this case. Sneaking out. Is he sneaking out, or did he just walk out? Because if by adding the word sneaky, you make it look suspicious. Sneaking out after midnight, like a man on a mission. Again, adding a bunch of detail to make it look like it's very sketchy. He walked out the long drive in the starlit chill to deposit the family's trash bags in the next door neighbor's bins. The family's trash bags and the next door neighbor's bins. When she put a name on the purpose to it all she'd been witnessing, it left her shaking. Now, I understand you're going to think that I'm just doing everything I can in my freaking creative mind to come up with excuses for what clearly is sketchy ass behavior. Let's break this down a little bit further. What do you believe, if you think this is proof of guilt, what do you believe Brian Kohberger is doing vacuuming the car? He's not getting his own DNA out of the car. It's his car. Nobody would be suspicious about his own DNA being in the car. So then you go to the logic, he must be trying to get the victim's DNA. Maybe he drug a hair sample from one of the victims into his car. So he's trying to clean that up. Okay, so let's follow that logic. Brian Kohberger vacuumed up the car. He puts things out in the trash. The feds get the trash. Guess what? There's no DNA from the victims. So whose DNA is he vacuuming up? Whose DNA do they get? They get his dad's DNA, and they use his dad's DNA to say that it is 99.99 ass ridiculous number likelihood that his dad is the biological father of whoever left the DNA at the crime scene in Pullman, Washington. Therefore, we know it must be Brian Kohberger who was at the crime scene, because the DNA from the trash, which was only his dad's DNA and probably his, but they didn't mention that, is a statistical match to the biological father of somebody back in Moscow, Idaho. Therefore, he must be the killer. Again, let's keep in mind what wasn't found: any of the victim's DNA. Now, I have a plausible explanation for the if Brian Koberger was involved in it that nobody ever seems to notice, right? It can't be that he's trying to clean up the victim's DNA, because again, they would have found that in the trash, but they didn't. Now, how would there be a possible explanation of DNA that he's trying to cover up, but that law enforcement didn't find? Well, if other people aren't on law enforcement's radar, they're not going to look for other DNA. They're looking for specific DNA. They may have looked for the DNA of the victims in his car when they were going through the trash and they didn't find it. They may have I wouldn't bother looking for Brian Koberger's DNA in his trash, because it's his car, so of course his DNA is going to be there. And then they look for other people and they get Brian Koberger. It's like a stretch. Like, well, shit, let's get Brian Koberger's dad's DNA and see if it's a match to the biological relative of whoever left the DNA. And that's what they did. Now, here's the argument that I would make that would be a better thing. Brian Koberger allegedly asked when he was arrested, it hasn't been proven, I don't think, allegedly asked, has anybody else been arrested for this? Suggesting that perhaps Brian Koberger could have been involved, but he knows that he was involved with other people. And he wants to know if any of those other people have been picked up, or is he getting fingered as the only guy? And so if that is a hint that Brian Koberger did have some involvement, but that others were there too. And then if you follow my logic where I have multiple videos, what if Brian Koberger was simply the getaway driver? What if he took somebody to the scene and dropped them off? Somebody else went into the house, or a group of people went into the house, committed the murders, and so on. And Brian Koberger sped away, perhaps not even with the individuals getting back in the car. Maybe he saw that it went down and he got panicked and he left the scene. If he was a getaway driver and therefore knew what was going on, and he had the killer who was in that house in his car, one could maybe say, maybe Brian Koberger is cleaning up DNA, but he's trying to get the DNA of alternative suspects, people who were in his car that he knows may have committed the murder or did commit the murder, and he's trying to get himself detached from them as far as possible. That would be a plausible explanation, but that's not, as far as I know, on anyone's radar. Nobody suggests that what Brian Koberger was trying to clean up was other perpetrators who might have been in the car with him. It's for you, he's trying to get DNA of the victims out of his car. They didn't find any of the DNA of the victims, so that's asinine. If he was putting it in little baggies, explain to me what he's doing there. Is he going to bag it up and put victim 1 on baggie 1 and victim 2 on baggie 2 so the police can have a better chance of identifying? Why do you think he's putting things in baggies? That doesn't make any sense. When you read this a little bit more carefully, he's depositing the family's trash bags, the family's, not, again, wording, maybe me reading too much into it, but it doesn't say Brian Koberger's putting his little Ziploc baggies from his car into the trash of the next door neighbor's bin. He's taking the family trash out. He's taking the family trash out and he puts it in the neighbor's bin. There are reasons, and I realize you're thinking of making mental gymnastics, but I want to end on this thought. In many cities, if your trash can is full and you need to put out another bag of trash beside your trash can, you get charged money for the extra bags of trash. So if it's trash day and trash is getting picked up in the morning and Brian Koberger was asked by the family or whatever, hey, can you take out the trash before going to bed? And he's taking the trash out. And if their trash can is full, but the neighbor's trash can isn't, it is not uncommon for people to open up the neighbor's trash can that's got the lid closed and not overfilled and throw their trash on top and close the lid because they don't get charged for that bag of trash. Oh my God, that makes you a killer. No, it doesn't make you a killer. It makes you wanted to save a few bucks for your family, but not putting the trash out. Now, I'm not saying that's what happened that night with Brian Koberger. I don't know. What I am saying is that you can build a circumstantial case and make anybody look guilty by taking random things and then making it sound creepy. Snuck out of the house in the middle of the night, creeped out there, and all using words can paint a narrative. Maybe it was simply a matter of, hey, Brian, can you take the trash out tonight before you go to bed? Sure, no problem. And he takes the trash out, their trash can's full. So he goes to the neighbor's trash can, throws their trash in there. And we're going to spin that narrative of how creepy it was. He was up in the middle of the night. He's a night owl. He's always up late at night. He probably is always up late at night. That's been covered a million times. But again, if you have decided Brian Koberger is the name and now you need to build a story, that's how you build a story.